of the problem. I tend to agree with both Elaine and Yasha in saying that.
I thought we disagreed.
Well, I mean, no, but I agree with you on something that you agreed on, which is that that identity politics, as usually described in the Democratic Party, can go too far and can be a problem. But from my point of view, we need to go back to a deeper level of why that is happening in the recent past and in the present, and that has to do with the fact that the country as a whole has become polarized, and we no longer agree about what unites us. And when that happens, when we don't have consensus on that question, the groups that comprise the whole begin to identify themselves with their part rather than the whole. And so then, once that is happening, what you end up with is the fact the Democratic Party has for a very long time been a kind of coalition of interest groups, and there's nothing shameful about that. It's a reality. But the problem, if you don't have any overarching vision of what those groups belong in, a larger whole, what you end up with is the groups that you're identifying with are those interest groups, and then you add in social media, which gives a megaphone to each group, and you end up with a party that is nothing more than the aggregate of interest groups and the activists that lead them. And so I think that's sort of why we've ended up in this place. But what is the solution to that? The solution is I think, to try to get Democratic politicians as much as possible to try and come up with some account of a larger whole in which those parts belong. And that's very, very difficult, again, precisely because we don't agree. There's a lot of disagreement among Americans about who we are, what is the national vision of the country, what does our history mean, where do we go from here, what should the government be doing? Even, again, like immigration, I'm sure will keep coming up, but that's a major fault line. You have like 30-something% of the country that really wants immigration essentially to stop. And then you have like 2/3, maybe not quite that much, that actually is warmer to immigration than ever before. That's not a question where like you can find an easy compromise and say, well, America is this, and it unifies these things. It's hard to see that. It's like when abortion is talked about as either abortion on demand to 40 weeks or banned in all cases. There's no way to square those two positions. They contradict each other completely. And so that's the problem, and I think that's the underlying structural reason why identity politics is so much on the table.
Now I'm going to stand up for compromise in the middle. I think there are actually reasonable middles in those things. I mean, by the way, Europeans have found a set of answers on abortion which are certainly between those extremes, and it's more or less pacified the politics around that in most of the continent. I think that's possible on the other things you're talking about as well, by the way. So, I think, by the way, Barack Obama mostly did that in his story of what America is. Obama was never hesitant to speak about the darker sides of American history, but in talking about them, he always emphasized that the struggle against those injustices and the gradual overcoming of them, incomplete but gradual overcoming of them, is just as much part of the American story. And he was very astute in showing that that was always a pan-American struggle as well. That, of course, African Americans were at the forefront of the civil rights movement, but they had allies in every religion, in every community in the United States. And Cory Booker has very astutely, I think, used that in his announcement video for the presidency a few months ago, when he was talking about the moving story of his parents desegregating a neighborhood, being the first black family to move into an all-white neighborhood, as the video says, flashing a picture of them with the help of some white lawyers who had been inspired by Martin Luther King Jr., right? So this has always been an all-American story, and I think that has to be our story. Kamala Harris rightly at Netroots a year ago said, this is our flag, don't let them take it away from us. We need to reclaim the symbols of America, not by expunging the dark parts of our history, but by saying that our progress against those injustices is part of what makes our national symbols and is part of what makes our national identity. And I think that is a center in which the large majority of Americans see themselves. There are some people on the far left fringe who just want to associate America with injustice and who are not going to accept that. I don't think they're particularly politically relevant. There are certainly a lot of people on the far right who want to say any negative word about America, anything that doesn't just make it a story of white triumph is unacceptable. I think we can win against them without a problem. So that's the story. I think there's a second question that we don't ask enough, which is, what's our vision of the future? What actually do we want the future of a multi-ethnic society to be? And I'm thinking about that at the moment. I'm sort of trying to write a book on it. And I think the key thing to me here is that we should both be more bold in predicting and more bold in advocating for a future in which we actually have lots of bridges between us. I think sometimes Democrats can be tempted to talk about the inevitable demographic majority. We're going to have all of these different minority groups. They're always going to build this stable coalition. They'll all be quite separate from each other, and we'll somehow keep them together and we'll win. I both doubt empirically that that is going to be the case. If you had fast-forwarded Irish-American voting behavior in 1920 and assumed that by 1970 Irish-Americans would all still vote Democrat, you would have been wrong. I think that's going to be true of Asian Americans and Latinos and so on right now. But I also think it's normatively and morally wrong. There are huge intermarriage rates among many minorities, Asian Americans, Jews, Latinos, and a growing number of African Americans. The reality that we have is far more mixed, is far more interactive, has far more cultural appropriation of the good kind than people on Twitter seem to believe. And so I think when we're both predicting against the fears of the far right and advocating against the most extreme outliers and outriders of a sort of separate lanes multiculturalism, the fact that America is going to mix and is going to have more in common with each other as time progresses, that can be a second leg for this narrative to stand on.
I liked your point about the importance of knowing what you're actually about and trying to just actually reclaim the values that are sort of constitutive of kind of American identity and ideals. One of those is equality, and part of our history is that we've never done it very well, and there's a lot of struggle to achieve it. So I'm glad you brought up Martin Luther King, because I think he raises a nice example of the difficulty of distinguishing between moderation in a broader moral sense and moderation in a narrower political sense. So if you ask me, moderation, Aristotle said, was it's a mean between an excess, like a vice of excess and a vice of deficiency, and that's hard to know where that is in any particular issue. But that's not kind of what the political dimension is like, right? The whole political dimension can be on one side of the mean. So one party can just be more excessive and the other party can be less excessive. And if you're just splitting the difference, you're just going to be, in second place in terms of committing the vice of excess. In that case, finding the actual mean, which is the moderate position, so for MLK, that is actually giving people substantive legal equality, right? That seems radical, right? Because MLK wasn't considered a moderate. He was considered a radical agitator. But now he's gotten a reputation for a certain kind of moderation, and I think it's because he's appealing to this basic value.
So there's two very brief points. First of all, moderation is your guys' term, not mine, so it's on the Nishkan and Sent. I dissociate myself. But more seriously, moderation, to be useful, has to be thought of in relation to a set of founding values and philosophical ideals. And to me, those ideals are the ideals of liberal democracy. And I think a large majority of American citizens agree with that. Those have, imperfectly realized, always been the ideals of this country. Now, at the time of Martin Luther King, we claimed that those were our ideals, and the reality was wildly out of whack with it. And so in one sense, you're right, MLK was a radical because he was saying the status quo as it exists is deeply unjust. I'm way far off to one side of it. But in that broader sense, he was always explicitly making arguments about standing right at the center of the American moral tradition, saying, I am making reference to the ideals of the Constitution, and all of you are failing to live up to it. And so I think that's the North Star of moderation, which will sometimes require us to split the difference, and sometimes require us to say everything that's happening at the moment is entirely unacceptable, and we have to reinvent something.
Let me get in here. Moderation has a bad connotation, right? It's not very sexy, it's not very inspiring, etc. But I think you have to look at the historical context of the country you're talking about. So the other way to look at moderation is incrementalism. So let's take a radical idea, Medicare for all. What are we going to end up with when the dust settles on Medicare for all? We're probably going to end up with a 55-year-old buy-in to Medicare. That's what we're going to end up with. Come on, everybody, we know that. Why? Because we have a multi-trillion-dollar healthcare insurance complex industry, and the transition costs in modern countries, modern democracies, from moving to one system to another radically different system, always kill it. They always kill it. And so that's why, yes, the debate will sound radical, but the political reality in a functioning democracy, now I don't mean a country that's never had a healthcare system or has no rule of law, but the political reality in a functioning democracy is always going to end up being some form of incrementalism. And that's not bad, that's great, okay? That means we are a stable society in which people can plan, invest money, etc. We have what so much of the rest of the world does not have, which is stability. And so I would just sort of caution us not to, yes, of course we want to be grounded in our values, etc., but we have enormous existing status quo systems in all the established democracies of the world. When those systems change, they're going to change incrementally, unless for some other reason they all collapse, which frankly doesn't look likely. And so what we're looking at as sort of radical ideas here, I beg to differ. They're not so radical.
But don't you think we need to distinguish between what guiding values should be and what the reality may turn out to be? Now, in the sense in which you're talking about it, I agree that the most likely outcome of Democratic presidential candidates running on Medicare for all is that we get some kind of 55-year-old Medicare buy-in, which is incremental progress, and perhaps we should be happy with that, I don't know. But you know, if we then only aim for that, we end up with even less, right? It doesn't seem to me that moderation, in the sense you're talking about, is, it may be a constraint on reality. It may be something where if we achieve that, we can still go home and say, well, we made the world a little bit better. But that's not a grand ideal we should be aiming for. And I personally don't know there's so many different models of Medicare for all. I don't know which one is which and whether I'm for it or not, it depends on the particular setup. But even the most radical suggestion of Medicare for all is not radical in the scheme of the values of liberal democracy, because you know what, you look around the world and practically every other democracy already has it. May not be a good idea substantively, certainly may not be a good idea electorally. To say that that's radical and we as moderates, insofar as we are, should sort of reject it on those grounds, that seems to me to end up with much too much of a sort of, let's split the difference and aim for a little bit of incremental change, and that's sort of reasonable and fine, and let's not aim too high. That's very uninspiring.
I would counter that just by saying that when politicians, year after year, election after election, promise the moon and deliver much less, it has a corrosive effect on democracy. We should not be shy about saying we can do A, B, and C to our healthcare system.
But you can do that while still aiming high. You can say, I'm going to fight for Medicare for all, and you know what? I'm going to level with you. We may not get there. We may only get to buy-in at 55, but I'm going to fight for that.
But that's incrementalism. That's, in the end, incrementalism. I mean, in other words, it's reality. I really think that we have gotten into a situation where, and I remember Martin Gurry's comments on the earlier panel, right? Social media has increased the attraction and the legitimacy of a set of ideas that in fact are not real and are simply not real. So to the extent that our political rhetoric diverges from the political possibilities, you really create an increasing distrust in the political class, and a feeling that gives rise to forms of populism, a feeling that somehow the political class, why they're corrupt, there's something wrong with them. Well, there's nothing wrong with them. We have, I will tell you, having studied corruption around the world, we have a marvelously uncorrupt governmental system. But in fact, the feeling of corruption is exacerbated when politicians go out there and say things that simply are not going to happen. And if they did happen, people would be up in arms. So I'm going to give you a simple example. Pass Medicare for all and prohibit all private health insurance. I can tell you that would, now you want to see a revolution? That would be one. Okay? That would be one.
Well, this reminds me of one of my favorite phrases as a half Canadian. I like it. Like, what do we want? Incremental change. When do we want it? In due course. And I mean, that's
You
sexy.
Canadians
That
are-
is sexy.
Can I jump in on that?
Yeah, please, Damon.
I guess I would like to maybe pivot the conversation, or at least attempt to, a little bit, in that I feel like the way we conceive of what moderation is, and then its political corollary of centrism, is kind of stuck. And I mean that it's stuck in our political culture to some extent, and in this room, definitely. I think we're dealing with the exhaustion of where lines were drawn about 3 or 4 decades ago. You had Thatcher coming to power in England, and then you had Reagan coming to power here. And as Elaine said at the beginning, Democrats lost in 1984, then they lost in 1988, and there was a lot of frustration that we need to reform ourselves, and due to Elaine's very admirable efforts, the Democratic Party did. It reformed itself through the Democratic Leadership Council and other groups that were formed to try to move the party to the center. Then, the center then was what? It was basically Reagan, but light. So it was, you had on economic policy a slightly softer version of Reaganism, slightly higher taxes, slightly more regulation, but emphasis on free markets and cost-benefit analysis in looking at public policy. On social issues, you had pretty much liberalism, but liberalism a little moderated. You had safe, legal, and rare on abortion rather than abortion on demand in all cases. In foreign policy, you also basically had Reaganism, but with more emphasis on multilateralism, going through the UN, but basically hawkishness, a hawkish foreign policy. And all of those issues were moderate. There were moderations of where the Democratic Party was, say, from McGovern through the 1980s elections, where the Democrats lost for the presidency. Now, I think what we need to keep in mind is that maybe the lines have started to shift, and that Trump's shocking victory is a sign that those lines are shifting and have not settled yet, and we're still trying to figure out where a new moderation should be. And yet, what I keep hearing is people from the center, on the center right, people who were deposed kind of by Trump winning.
It's a great time to wash the windows.
Yeah. And then on the center left, you hear a kind of repeat of kind of vaguely stated Clintonism, and I would actually say that I think Obama was pretty much in that vein, pretty much where he came down on things. So what I would like to propose is to take account of what was found in the voter study group from June 2017. If you've all seen this, you can look it up later or on your phones. This scatter plot with 2 dimensions where you had basically economic, left, right, and then social identity questions, left, right. And what you found with voters in the 2016 election was that you had the voters kind of scattered in all 3 quadrants, except for the quadrant that contains what you might call soft libertarianism, which is sort of where we've been placing the center. So if hard Reaganism would be like, kind of Cato Institute libertarianism, but he even himself wasn't there, but kind of in that direction. And then Clintonism was that moderated a little bit, but not that much. And then similarly on social issues, would be total liberalism on social issues, but moderated in a little bit. And so I think that quadrant was relatively empty of voters. If you want a center, a new center, it was in the opposite quadrant on that chart. What is that? Soft Trumpism, basically. You could also call it soft communitarianism, if you want to be more polemical, soft authoritarianism. Let me list a few brief things that are in that quadrant. And there were a lot of voters in that quadrant. And actually, one reason, what you see when you look at it is that Democrats are actually very much clustered in the kind of the liberal quadrant. Republicans were actually spread almost evenly between the other quadrants, which explains how Trump could win with what he was saying. So what would that be? Industrial policy might be open to that. Trade restrictionism, again, not necessarily like hard tariffs on everything, but open to that, a message of that in order to protect American jobs. Protections for middle-class government benefits. Remember Trump ran saying he was going to protect Social Security and Medicare? Hasn't really done anything about that at all. In fact, he ended up going with the Paul Ryan agenda when he got into power, and so kind of shucked a lot of that totally by the wayside. Higher tax rates for the wealthy, totally open to that. Polls show that, like 60, 70% would favor sharply higher taxes on high-income Americans. Suspicious of open immigration, not build a wall necessarily, but concerned about what is the mix, low skill, high skill. We can't just have a kind of default allowing whatever happens, whoever comes gets in.
So would it be bad to aim at that?
I actually don't think it would be bad. I think that that's where the center really is in this country, and I wish that someone in the parties, a more responsible Republican than Trump, and a good, smart Democrat would be willing to try to occupy some of that territory.
So kind of like a more soft nationalism.
All my deepest respect and most acute love, Damon, that you just presented a relatively reasonable set of policy ideas in the least attractive possible clothes. And I know that you were being sort of polemical in saying that's soft authoritarianism, but I think as long as you're thinking in these one-dimensional scales, you're going to go wrong. Now, what this very nice quadrant does, Lee Drutman and the Verta Study Group did that, and I encourage you all to go look it up, is to disaggregate the one-dimensional scale and say, let's have two of those, one for the economy and one for social issues. That's still simplistic, because I think where people are is off of those scales from each of those. So I started talking about that on the social stuff, which you can call identity politics if you want. I think it goes beyond that. It's not a very helpful term. People aren't at the arithmetic midway point between let's just be an association of communities in which we lead completely separate lives and have nothing to do with each other, and unless you're Mexican, you're not allowed to cook Mexican food. Nobody in this country is there. And people are also not at the other extreme of basically being soft racists or more or less explicit racists. And trying to find the middle between those two things is only going to confuse you. Instead, they're in a reasonable place where they're saying, we want to make reference back to American ideals. We want people to be valued as individuals. And at the moment, there are some individuals in our country who, because of their belonging to a particular group, are discriminated against. And we want to fight against that with all of our might. That's the same on the economic thing. If you say, Americans want some middle between Paul Ryan and AOC, I don't know where you end up. You end up with complete incoherence.
Right.
But what does make sense is to say that Americans want capitalism. You're not going to convince them to vote for socialism. You're not going to convince them for abolishing capitalism. But they also think that the capitalist system at the moment isn't working very well at all. That it is screwing them over, that they don't have to play by the rules, I know I'm being upstaged by the flag or something. They don't have to play. It's better than that. Oh, that is very good.
Doing a very difficult. He's doing a difficult job under difficult circumstances.
I know, thank you
They're
very
going to
much.
love that. The streaming people are going to really love this. Oh, look, they're cleaning the windows.
But on economic issues, it's to say, look, we like free enterprise, we like opportunity. We also think that at the moment, most people have to play by the rules and the rich don't. And we have to stand up against what basically is a form of crony capitalism on behalf of people. Now, I think in substance, that's not so different from what you were saying, but I think as long as you're framing it as, the extremes are here and let's go in the middle between them, it's going to be muddled. This is actually a coherent set of beliefs which is rooted in long-term American ideals and which can point the way forward to some radical reforms that are moderate in values.
Just briefly, in response to that, I don't think I think we're saying potentially harmonious things. Yeah. I listed a bunch of policies just to get them out there as what might comprise a new center. And what you're saying is the absolute necessary analog to them. People don't, for the most part, vote because of policies. This political science literature on this is pretty robust. They vote for other things, identity, part of it, identifying with some vision of the country and its future and whether they feel they belong to that story. And what you are articulating is one way of trying to tell a story about why those policies make sense and are just for a better America. And all I'm saying is that I'm like the worst example would be like a Howard Schultz. Sorry, anyone who's friends with Howard, maybe he's even here. Like there is a tendency of people to kind of just to put a big centrist sticker on their chest and describe themselves as moderate. And I'm a centrist. Well, what are you for? I'm for what I said earlier, I'm not Reagan, but I'm sort of like Reagan on this, and I'm not like McGovern, I'm actually more like this kind of very more moderate version of that, and it's always set in relation to where we drew the lines post-Reagan's election. And it might be that actually we need to just reconceive of where people are and where they feel they belong in our country, and therefore the center isn't there anymore. It's not totally far out, but it's different.
Well, and maybe that's because, and to use an overused phrase, maybe it's because we've run through the neoliberal paradigm. Maybe it's because we're at the end of understanding one way of doing things, and we're just groping towards a new way of doing things. And I look at that in economics in terms of the rise of inequality. Okay, and so what do we do about that? How do we not throw out the baby with the bathwater? I look at that in terms of climate change. Both cap and trade and a carbon tax have proved to be very unhelpful and unpopular, and we're not going to get there. Okay, so what should we be thinking about? Maybe we should be thinking about adaptation. Maybe we should be thinking about carbon capture. I mean, in other words, the whole paradigm that has existed really since Reagan and Clinton, I agree with you, and through Obama, doesn't seem to offer us anything very meaningful anymore. And perhaps it's time to turn the clock, and whoever can articulate that intellectually and articulate that then politically, I think they're going to have a winner, and we'll get out of this rut. It's almost like we're in a terrible rut right now. I look at political change as a triangle. So down here in the bottom layer are academics, think tanks, people who are trying to think things through. They get picked up by the press, who makes them into stories as good storytellers. They get picked up by the politicians, who put them into speeches. And they finally become a bumper sticker. If you do not have all of those, if you only have the bumper sticker, it doesn't happen. If you only have the academic papers, as many of us know, it doesn't happen either. Okay, so you need this to change, to have change that is not incremental, but that is really a big and a basic change. And I think that your scatter plot is showing a kind of rut that we're in, And there's probably something around the corner. I don't know if I'll be around for it, but I think that some people will.
Just to pick up on that for 1 second, I mean, we didn't really end up talking a lot about history on this panel.
Yeah.
But I think you're absolutely right about that. But when you go back to Clinton, you go back to Tony Blair, you go back to those figures, they weren't just, you know, before me some people were here and some people were there, and I, the genius, have figured out how to be here. Right? That's easy. If that was all that it took, then we'd have a figure like that at every election. They actually had a new analysis of what the divisions in society were, and a new analysis how, on that conception, you can have a 60-65% position that actually a lot of people are attracted to because it eschews the old terms. Now, when the question of the panel is how do we learn from history, is not by going back and running their model again and running their policy suggestions again, because they were developed in a different context at a different time. But it is to try and succeed in a similar undertaking today. And if Nishkan is going to succeed in something, I hope it's helping to prepare the intellectual ground for that.
Well, thank you. I would suggest that there isn't a fact of the matter like where the center is in terms of the opinions of voters, because they go all over the place so quickly. So if we're talking about like being open to protectionist trade policy or attitudes about immigration, those have gone all over the place just since Trump became president, which is part of the problem. Just like there's not, like trying to triangulate on where voters are doesn't give you any guidance, because voters are kind of more guided. They're more guided by elites than elites really reflect popular sentiment a lot of times. Like I'll go back to the Iraq War, which is like nobody wanted to do that. It's not like there was like some sort of pre-existing sort of popular impulse to invade this country for no particular reason. But like a bunch of elites decided that this was incredibly important. People were angry about 9/11. There was some connection made. And then that became the centrist position, right? That became like you were kind of like crazy if you like were against it or something like that. And then it flipped again, where like Donald Trump had to kind of like lie about always being against it because being for it was unpopular with Republican voters. So again, you have that kind of dynamic where you need some kind of principle that is, you know, tying you to a course of action, because if you're just chasing the center, it's just formless.
But often you think that opinion randomly flip-flops when you don't have an accurate analysis of what drives public opinion. So on a question like immigration, it looks like every public in Europe and North America has flip-flopped on this, because in every public you've had immigration restrictionist candidates win, and then publics rebel against really cruel policies, whether it's the separation of parents from their children at the border in the United States, or the scandal over the Windrush generation in Britain. Now, I think actually what's going on is a deeper incoherence, which is that publics in virtually every country in the world, and America is perhaps most pro-immigration at the moment, but even there it's a plurality of people, want only legal immigration and less immigration. Now, they also don't want any state cruelty in order to ensure that outcome. And unfortunately, those two concurrent ideals just aren't available. If you want to ensure that there's no illegal immigration and that there's quite restrictive legal migration, then it will involve lots and lots of cruelty. And so the problem is that publics are not changing their mind all of the time. They are different parts of their consistent, temporarily consistent, if deep level incoherent preferences take precedence at different moments. So once you understand that, you can try and formulate a policy which minimalizes cruelty while still trying to give people a sense that they actually are in charge of who comes into the country and so on. And then I think you can wait out those rough winds a little bit better. If it's just a sense of, well, public opinion jumps back and forth and let's just wait for whatever happens, I don't think that's very helpful in terms of orientation.
Well, we have time for one or two questions before we wrap up. I think my conclusion from this so far is that we have not figured out what moderation is or what its lessons from history are, but we've started a good conversation. Are there some questions? I see a hand there. If somebody wants to bring that gentleman the mic. Apologies to the people on this side of the room who I was not facing when I asked that.
Hi, thank you all for coming. It seems between this conversation, reading all of your writings and seeing what Sherrod Brown is saying and what Marco Rubio is saying, that one could imagine a new center on social insurance, immigration, the national question, and so on. It does seem harder, though, to create a new center on issues like abortion, guns, constitutional law, legal jurisprudence, and so on and so forth, let alone foreign policy. So I guess how could we form a new consensus, or at least some kind of stalemate, if you will, on those older debates as opposed to new ones?
Well, I agree it's very difficult, and I'm a pessimist. I mean, the fact is, because of various structural things, the way elections are working in this country, social media being a big deal, negative partisanship, all of these things together create huge incentives for whoever is the candidate not trying to forge some kind of new consensus to create a kind of caricature of that new attempt and to rally their own side in opposition to it by lying about it and then trying to win on that basis. And that, I don't see how to stop that process. So that's I think, kind of the conundrum that we're all in, that one reason why this isn't just an American story, but as Yasha knows better than anyone else perhaps in the room, because he studies it all over the world, I mean, this is happening in lots and lots of places. And that means there must be causes that go well beyond this country and its pathologies of its political culture at the moment. And something is driving this kind of polarization of extremes, and one of them, I think, is Martin Curry was saying about social media and in general the kind of flood of information and the way it gets manipulated for people, and the incentive structure that creates for politicians who want to win above all.
On that question, I would say I'm a little more optimistic, because I think those issues on things like guns and abortion, a lot of things aren't necessarily as intransigent as people think, because I don't think there's broad recognition of the extent to which those views themselves are driven by partisan sentiment, and that partisan sentiment is driven by group identity and a drive to protect your group's interest. I think bearing down on abortion, bearing down on guns, as you were saying, as sort of like symbolic signals of commitment to a certain kind of like white Christian identity, that's kind of the point of those things, and they're used functionally to keep a group of people together into a coherent bloc who shares a bunch of really strong moral motivations that get them to the polls and help them win. Once that bloc, which is really homogeneous, of relatively of older white Christian, mostly rural people, if they can no longer win elections with that group of people, if they want to keep winning, it has to broaden. The coalition has to get bigger. They have to start digging into, getting inside the outer suburbs, bringing in more women, bringing in more non-white voters. And that changes what the partisan identity is, and those issues soften as soon as the people in your coalition don't share the same identity that drives the commitment to those positions. So I think we actually might be on the cusp of a lot of those things going away, but as Elaine was saying, what it takes is a devastating loss.
Right, exactly.
We've got time for one more quick question. Over here.
Thanks, and thank you for all your comments. I'm Richard Idland with Business for America. And I keep thinking it's like Coke and Pepsi, right? So what makes us think that the Democratic and Republican parties can solve these problems? Because in many ways they represent a duopoly. So I'd be curious to know the role of the third party or fourth parties. We've had those in this economy and the system before. And it seems as though that's maybe one path out of the current conundrum, where when we look at the word moderation, maybe neither party is really equipped to get us there.
Political scientists?
Can I talk about that?
Yeah.
I mean, Frances is looking at me because she knows what I'm going to say. I mean, can I tell you that political scientists will tell you one thing? Third parties or fourth parties in American politics don't succeed. They don't succeed for structural reasons, which is we have one past the post a system, and therefore in the Electoral College and in Congress. So a minority party can't ever, get a proportion of the vote the way they can in a proportional system. So there's a real structural inhibitor against third or fourth parties. What third parties have done, however, is they get eaten up by one of the big parties. We know now that the Ross Perot voters became Republicans. They became a piece of the Republican coalition. Third party movements, to the extent that they get powerful, they do one of two things. They either change one of the major parties, and that's how the major parties change. It's one of the ways they change, is third parties become a faction within those parties, or they exist as spoilers in the election. And so whether the third party is of the left or the right or the center, there's a real danger. And that's why a lot of people are very angry at Howard Schultz. Okay, there's a real danger that in close contests, a third party candidate, independent candidate, could in fact tip the balance in one direction or the other. Third parties, I don't think, have ever been the answer in American politics, and at least for the foreseeable future, I don't think they will be the answer. And that's why I think a lot of people have realized that it's actually primaries that matter. Because what primaries do is primaries are where factions within each party play out the battle for the brand, Coke or Pepsi, right? The brand of each party is constantly shifting, okay? And the way the brand shifts is it shifts through mostly the primary process and the struggle for power within that party. It doesn't really shift because of third parties, except for if you get a third party that's getting into the double digits, which they usually don't get.
Just to run with that for 1 second, I like Coke and I tolerate Pepsi. The problem at the moment is that we face a choice between, Dr. Pepper and Iron Brew or something. So if we can get it back to Coke and Pepsi, that wouldn't be too bad.
Diet Dr. Pepper is superior. Thank you for your attention, and thank you for your questions, and let's give our panelists a round of applause. Thank you so much. Right now, a lunch is available in the atrium outside the room.
There you go.
All right, thank you. That was wonderful. Appreciate it. Thanks, Sasha. That was great. Elaine, thank you. That was wonderful.
Good to see you.
Yeah.
That was a new one.
What's that?
Just the acrobatic.
Yeah, great. I'm okay. So we should not speak. So there was nothing published from his notebooks then. No.
Great. Hints and guesses.
Okay.
Yeah, I used to go there now.
He was.
That was my whole dissertation. Was like a religious doctrine. I was the
Yeah.
And so I guess and I was able to have one day with him before he died. Yeah. Where we talked about it.
Oh, so you know.
Yeah, right. No, absolutely. Yeah. Right.
Well.
Yeah. Oh, of course. How are you? Nice to meet you. How are you doing? Definitely.
I turn over. I'm here and you're free.
Yeah, well, it's nice to meet you.
What's the question?
She's right on my arm. Thanks for passing it out.
Let's get started, shall we? So welcome to the last